After spending some time revisiting Robotech Battlecry, I started to wonder what the actual Macross games of the time must have been like. Although Gundam fans can sometimes complain about the quality or lack thereof in Gundam games, at least we actually got a handful of them released in the West. Western Macross fans, on the other hand, haven't been so lucky historically. So I went out to find a Macross game that was made for the PlayStation 2 and that was released relatively close to the time Robotech Battlecry was also released. Super Dimension Fortress Macross ended up being that game. It was released in 2003 and tells its story a little similar to the Ace Pilot mode in Mobile Suit Gundam Encounters in Space. The game actually has two campaigns that tell roughly the same story, except one follows the events of the original anime, while the other follows more closely the events of the film. The armed 01 route is shorter with only 8 stages, but they could be considered a little more difficult, although I personally only considered it to have 1 or 2 slightly more annoying stages. Stage 4 being perhaps the one giving me the most trouble in my first playthrough. The Prometheus route is longer with 12 stages. These are slightly easier. The only time I struggled was in stage 2 when I struggled to land on top of the waypoint marker like I was supposed to, and it would result in a mission fail. And in both campaigns, you play as an original character who only sometimes kind of interacts with the main characters of the show. Not really though. I actually view this as a plus because it sort of adds a layer of immersion into the game. Unfortunately, there are no English subtitles, so unless you've watched either the anime or the film, you may have a hard time following along. But even if you don't speak or read Japanese, the game is still mostly accessible. The missions are straightforward for the most part, as long as you pay attention to the visuals in the mission briefings and also follow the purple arrows whenever they appear. As for the sound and music, I have to say that they are pretty solid. I especially love the sound design when you fire the gun pod. It's the best sound design I've heard in an anime-based mech game, even compared to Gundam games whenever using a machine gun. And yes, even that classic Minmay song is in here. Gameplay-wise, Ace Combat fans may feel right at home when in fighter mode. And to quickly get the Robotech Battlecry comparisons out of the way, the controls do handle a little differently. There is a boost limit in the game, which I think is unnecessary. Actually, I think boost limits in most mech games is unnecessary and often hinders the fun. But that's just a me thing. The gun pod in Macross does also overheat, but it refreshes almost instantly. Same goes for the missiles. Although you don't have an unlimited number of missiles, with the exception of one mission, you'll always have more than enough. And you do have a little more variety with the types of missiles you can use in certain stages of the game. The only thing I would argue that Robotech Battlecry did better was using the D-pad to change between the different Veritech modes. In Macross, the D-pad is only used to change between the different camera angles, which I never found any practical use for. And instead, you cycle through the different modes by using L2 and R2. It's not exactly bad, and it works well enough once you get used to it. There are 2 other control type options you can switch to in the options menu. But if I had to pick one over the other, this is the one time I'll pick Robotech over Macross. Now, that's a sentence I never thought I would say. Oh, and the level designs aren't as good either. The skybox or map of the levels aren't that big, and I often frequently accidentally got out of bounds. This is probably my biggest nitpick when it comes to playing mech games, as it is pretty common across the genre. There's even one stage in the Prometheus route where the limitations of this game design get exposed. When you're in the rings of Saturn, you're supposed to get to the destination within a certain time, but fly too fast and you'll constantly be told you're leaving the area. Lastly, for comparisons, there are some defense missions and one escort mission. I did find myself getting a little annoyed after the second time I needed to defend. I think this was mostly because of having just played through Robotech Battlecry, however. And to be honest, they're nowhere near as bad as Robotech Battlecry. Between the 2 campaign modes, Macross only has about 20 stages, so it doesn't exactly overstay its welcome. Each campaign can also be completed in around 1 or 2 hours. When in story mode, there's never any point where you can select whatever Valkyrie you want. But as far as I can tell, with the exception of the Elend Seeker, they all pretty much handle the same. And after completing either story mode, you will unlock free battle mode, where you can go back to any mission you want and use whatever unit you want. There are also some unlockables you can get based on what rank you score on every mission. And that's really all the game has to offer. The game is fun and it doesn't have all the extra fat that Robotech Battlecry had. While I did end up wishing that it had a little more to offer, at the same time I couldn't exactly think of what that something else could have been. There is one space mission near the end of the first campaign where I started to think that the mission is fun, but it would be even better if I could blow up some spaceships. And once I played through the second campaign mode, it was like the game said, "Hey there, heard you wanted to blow up some alien spaceships. Here are some tactical nukes to play around with. Have fun." It is relatively easy. In many instances, I found myself just flying around in a circle spamming missiles. And the boss fights are barely worth remembering because they're also pretty easy for the most part. Then again, most games are relatively easy once you figure out how to cheese them, so I don't mean it as a criticism. It's a single player game. If you want to play in a different way and make the game a little difficult, then by all means, have at it. Let all the dirty gatekeepers and backseat gamers cry while you have some fun. If I played this back in the day as a kid, I think I would have loved it, and I would have some nostalgia for it by now. Instead, I had to wait over 20 years later to finally get my hands on it. So, although I don't have any nostalgia for the game, I still have to say that it's a fun arcade-style mech game, as it goes for a lot of these Japanese games that were never released in the West. It's a shame because I think it could have had an audience for it here in the West, but at least that does seem to be changing with the more recent games. Anyway, let me know in the comments if you grew up playing this game. Obviously, I know more about Gundam than Macross because I never got that into it growing up. So I'm sure to some, this game probably means a lot more to them than it does to me. That's all for this video. Thank you all for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing if you haven't already. And thank you if you did already click on the red button. And I'll see you in the next one.